Welcome to my documentation of Phase 2. If you watched Phase 1, I thank you. I know there was a lot of talking and not much in the way of video footage, but that's about to change. This phase was very involving because there was so much that had to be worked out. At the end of Phase 1, half of my mock-up had been disassembled in order to allow for a final set of patterns to be prepared. And now I found myself veering into a path of panic. I was going to have to make some major cuts, and these cuts were based on me knowing pretty much nothing at all, despite the mock-up. Seam allowances, cording, assembly. I had found answers to so little, and the number of unanswered questions was downright overwhelming. I cannot tell you how many times I had to force myself to slow down, stop even, and just try to focus on exploring the possibilities of just one thing at a time. The basic concept of construction itself was a part that instilled a lot of fear in me, because initially I couldn't find any reference at all that gave clear guidance on the hows, whats, and whens. I knew that there was cording, which meant that there would have to be at least 2 layers, but there was also the busk and backboning, which would possibly require a heavier fabric. On the Leicestershire County Council page, they list only that the corset is made from a green-brown twill which has been lined with a beige coutil and interlined with hessian. Support is provided by cording across the hips and down the front with minimum whaleboning. So I decided to follow a 4-layer construction. A 2-part top layer, between which would be the cording, a burlap interlining, because I didn't have any hessian, and a canvas back. One thing that became very clear when I was researching corsets was the importance of correct grain line orientation. The curvatures of the body were clearly made allowance for, with bias grain appearing on the curves and straight grains inevitably appearing at the waistline. So, with that in mind, I did take the grain line very seriously, perhaps too seriously. I used the technique of painstakingly pulling or marking a thread down the entire length of the fabric in order to know exactly where the straight grain was. I then marked the grain line as needed on the pattern pieces and overlaid one with the other to ensure that everything was as it should be. I started out with cutting the burlap pieces because the much wider weave made it a lot easier to identify the threads. And then after practicing on that, I moved on to the canvas, which was incredibly more difficult. I did try just marking it with chalk, but the line was far too imprecise for my ever-growing obsession with grain line, so I opted to use a needle and thread to mark a clearer line. I then marked the outline of the pieces with chalk and cut them out with a seam allowance. As to the corded panels, I truly think I overthought and over-engineered them. I decided on a 1/8 inch cording channel through which I pulled a long fibre hemp twine. It was a snug fit, very snug. My reason for using the hemp was that it was similar in material and feel to the burlap. I used the hip panel to gauge the channel size. I had counted around 30 channels on a picture of the original, with an uncorded section at the bottom, and 30 times a 1/8 inch channel fit the space allocated. I did play around with some other channel sizes, but felt that the larger channels resulted in too flimsy of a panel, not to mention that a wider channel would have resulted in not being able to fit the 30 rows and thus veering away from the appearance of the original. Having never handled the original, however, I have no idea on how sturdy it was designed to be, but my panels certainly felt as if they would hold their shape very well. I tried 2 other cording methods, cording as I went and feeding the cording through the underlayer. Neither impressed me. The weave ended up fraying really badly when I tried pulling the cord through a hole made by an awl in the back, and as the cording on the bust panels flare away at the top, it wasn't practical to cord them on the fly. Furthermore, the resulting panel from attempting a cord-as-you-go technique ended up being much wider than my 1/8 of an inch. I used a basting stitch around the outside of the pieces in order to fix the 2 layers together before undertaking the cording. With the smaller pieces, I pinned extensively before cutting them out and then basted them. One problem that I noticed when doing the cording was the extent to which the very lightweight top layer was fraying at the point of inserting the cord. So I figured that I would piece together a stabilizer of sorts with a strip of my cotton fabric, only at the cording entrances where the fabric was under the most strain and most prone to fray. As I stitched the channels, I extended them to go over that extra layer of cotton, and then started inserting the cording between the 2 layers of cotton instead of between the cotton and the satin. I also decided to thread my bodkin with a heavy-duty guide thread, which would then be used to pull the hemp through, and the purpose of this was to try to keep the bulk down as much as possible whilst doing the cording. The hip panel contained the most cording, and after 3 corded channels were completed, I was faced with a sudden problem. I couldn't work out how to condense the information for this video, so I'm going to switch to the live audio from the time of filming.
So on the right side of the fabric, this fabric is a lot more flexible than the backing, and so if you look at the cross section here, you'll see that there's not a whole bunch of shape to the back piece, whereas on the front piece you really get that defined bumpy look of the cording. So this fabric is effectively bunching up around the cording, and as a result there's less fabric at the front than there is at the back, and this was completely laid flat and basted and stay stitched, or whatever you want to call it, to ensure that it was flat before I started. Now, after this has been done, if I push the fabric to flatten it out, you can see how it's bunching. So this tacking line here that I had put in to mark where the grain line was supposed to be, the fabric is there. I mean, I've got a whole channel and some worth of fabric, which makes sense because all the channel's showing on the other side, so it explains why the fabric's bunching at the back. But obviously if I were to continue just stitching with this without adjusting how these layers are fitting on top of each other, I would end up with some really weird things going on. In fact, the whole piece might start to warp away from the body, which is not at all what I want. It needs to be sitting close to the body. So what I have decided to do is work in small sections, and that's why I only did 3 channels here and on all of the other pieces that I had done so far. So this is the back panel. I've done 3 sections here, and you can see here as well the bump that's happening as this fabric is looser on the back layer than it is on the front. So again, this needs to be stretched out and relined. Now that it's positioned, I don't need this outline stitch or basting stitch quite so much, so I'll probably just pull it out and use pins to move as I go. But there's another channel to go on that side, and then another channel to go on this side, so there's 2 to do on either side. This is one of the bust panels. You can see the bunching on that side and the bunching on this side. Same thing there. This one I've already started to pin as it needs to be, and you can see the difference with how beautifully flat this is for now, whereas on this side it's completely bunched up. Now this side doesn't matter so much because this is going to be sewn in. This is where the seam line is over here, but I am definitely sure that I do not want to see any bunching there. In fact, this piece here that I had done as one of the trials gives a really good indication of what's happening, that on the front this effective gusset that's formed is beautifully flat. On the back though, there's so much extra fabric, so if I push in here, you know, we've got another cord worth of fabric just between these two, and I really want to eliminate that as much as possible.
With all of the panels corded, I remarked the proper edges from my pattern pieces. There had been shrinkage, so I wanted to make sure that the pieces would still be to the correct size. As I've already pointed out, most of the shrinkage was on the top layer, so the markings on the underside on the cotton only had to be changed marginally. The next step was to add the burlap. I planned to use the same technique used on collars and lapels, pad stitching, to incorporate shape. But this posed yet more questions: whether I should stitch it to the canvas or to the corded section, and whether I should do it before or after assembling the panels, and then the further question of whether I should assemble the front pieces with or without the burlap separate to the canvas with or without the burlap, or assemble everything together all at once in one pass. These types of questions troubled me for days. It was like I was an apprentice having to make executive level decisions. I made the choice to treat the seams as one, sewing everything either to the front or to the back. I must point out that in all of my research, I hadn't been able to locate a picture of the inside of the corset, so I could only assume that perhaps what I had thought were boning channels on the outside, until reading of the minimal boning from the Symington page, was actually seam casings. But whether turned out or in, it did mean that the individual panels would need to be finished before the whole thing could be assembled, and that I had a long way to go before I could get a glimpse of the finished product.
I just wanted to briefly discuss this piece, which has had the burlap secured temporarily to the canvas. Originally I was thinking, oh well, this will be nice, I can just pad stitch it directly to this and I don't have to worry about manipulating the cord underneath of it. But then I realized that if I were following normal procedure and effectively pad stitching it over my finger as I go, then the shape of this would be like so, when in reality your bust does not go into your body, it comes out from your body, so it would be going the opposite direction. And I wasn't really sure on how to proceed with that. I don't know that there's any instruction on how to pad stitch something in the opposite direction. It would certainly be a lot more difficult, just the mechanics of how the fabric is oriented to grab a single thread to pad stitch it on. So I abandoned this, but I just wanted to explain why this was attached to the canvas. So instead I will be pad stitching it onto the two-part outer layer, and yeah, time to rip some seams.
Before doing any pad stitching, the burlap pieces were trimmed down to the marked piece sizes so that there wouldn't be any burlap in the seams when joining the panels together, thus reducing the bulk at the seam line.
With the first half of this project rapidly coming to an end, I wanted to take a moment to regroup and think about how I was piecing everything together. I printed out some copies of photographs taken from the Symington collection. As I was looking at the pictures, the way that everything was put together seemed to stand out to me in a way that it didn't before. One thing in particular I've noticed has to do with the hip panel, and it's kind of made me feel a little bit like I've shot myself in the foot by not leaving enough fabric at the top. Let me show you what I mean. In this image, it appears that the front panel has been folded over the bust panels, side panel, and the hip panel. In other words, that these four panels are, well, five, are sewn together, and then the front piece is sewn on top. And you can see the same with the back. So here's the side panel, and then you've got three bust panels in the hip panel, and it looks as if this panel has been sewn right over top. And I don't know why, but I was thinking that this was like a boning channel, like a conventional boning channel that's sewn on after the fact, or a casing that's hiding the seam. But as I'm looking at it now, it doesn't look like that. Now, this channel here is most definitely a boning channel, because it extends from the top of this underarm side panel all the way down over top, and the only way that would happen is if it were a separate channel. But this, because of the lack of top stitching on the right hand side, I don't think that this is a separate casing. I think it is this piece that has been sort of folded over and sewn up and then top stitched down, which would mean that I need to sew together 1, 2, 3, 4, 3 bust underarm, and then fold them over and sew them to the hip, or that the hip panel comes up. Same goal as reached in the end. And where I feel I shot myself in the foot a bit is because I was simply thinking, okay, we'll stitch them together and then we'll put the separate casing over it. Well, after making the final markings and with the shrinkage of the fabric, this is where the actual edge of the pattern piece, well, no, it's just below. So, and that's pretty much on it. That's where the edge of the pattern piece should be. And I sewed this simply to try to stop this face fabric from fraying more than it is right now. So I don't have enough here. I mean, I barely have enough for a seam allowance, but I don't really have enough here to kind of sew anything together and fold it over. So that proves a little bit of a problem. And the way I'm going to work around it is I'm going to make a separate strip, 2-layer, and I'm going to sew it into the edge of this cording channel and basically make a wide piece of fabric, a wide, well, I guess it's like a casing. It's a pattern extension that will start here, extend up, fold over and behind so it can be sewn on. I don't like it, I really don't, but I'm thinking that's the best way to do it, both because of circumstantial difficulties and again looking at the image, it looks more like that's what's supposed to happen.
In February, life got busy. I took my pad stitching with me wherever I went, but ended up getting very little done. In March, COVID started taking over the world, which led to me undertaking much in the way of face mask making. In April, I finally was able to put some time aside to resume pad stitching, and then by the time May came around, with me reaching a personal new year at the start of the month, I was finally able to piece one half of my corset together. I sincerely hope you'll stick around for Phase 3, where, after months, a wearable corset emerges, and I share what I changed when I put the second half together.